Just a few days ago, I was given the opportunity to play the full version of Baldur's Gate 3 for 2 days with Larian in Gent, Belgium. And in this video series, I kind of want to talk about the things that I learned from playing that and talk about some changes that are coming to the game that you might not be aware of, even if you saw the panel from hell. In this first video, I almost exclusively want to talk a bit about Act 2. I'll probably add in a couple other details, but I know a lot of people are really curious how Act 2 of the game has played. People have been playing through Act 1 in early access over and over and over, and I know a lot of people have kind of stopped playing because they're waiting for more content, and the full version of the game is just around the corner at this point. So in this first part, I want to talk a bit about Act 2. And Act 2 is something I don't think you're going to hear much about from other press or content creators, and that's simply because the days were divided between press and content creators. So on the press day, we all started at the beginning of the game and played for 5 or 6 hours, and I eventually hit Act 2 at the end of the first day. But on the second day, most of the press left, some of them stayed, and then the content creators came in and they started from the beginning of the game and continued playing probably just up to Act 2 or barely into Act 2 like I did on day 1. But I was able to continue my save from the first day in Act 2, so that second day I got to play exclusively in Act 2 and see a lot of things that were there that maybe some other people did not see. Before I get into that, however, I do want to mention that this will have some minor spoilers. I'm going to be talking a bit about locations that were alluded to in Act 1 that were discussed. Talking about some of these locations and characters that are present in Act 2. Some of this you saw on the panel from hell, some of it you haven't. We don't have gameplay footage for a lot of what I'm going to be talking about, so you won't see the gameplay on the screen. But if you don't want to hear anything about it, I would suggest skipping this so that you don't get spoiled at all. So first of all, I want to say that I got to Act 2 not by going through the Underdark like you can. Instead, I went via the Githyanki area and through the Mountain Pass. So Act 2 essentially picks up after that point. But previously, you would go to this point in early access, and it would say you can't go there. Well, now we've gone through the Githyanki. We're on the next part of the map, and you basically have two options. You can go towards the Shadowlands, which they were showcased a bit in the panel from hell, which is kind of like the dark and gloomy lands, which I'll talk a little more about after this. Or you can go another direction, and you can go to the Githyanki Creche, which is where Lizelle wants to go because she thinks that they can help remove the tadpole from her head. So seeing as I had a lot of time, I decided to go to Githyanki Creche first and sort of explore that. We'd already seen the presentation of the Shadowlands at this point, so I had kind of seen a little bit of that area, and I wanted to see this area because this was completely new to me. And let me just say, before you even get there, there is a lot of exploration to be done that really showcases the three-dimensional nature of Baldur's Gate 3. And this is accomplished far more than Divinity Original Sin 1 and 2, in my opinion. There was more in Divinity Original Sin 2, but the extent of it in Baldur's Gate 3 is incredible. And what I mean by that is, obviously, these games have puzzles that you have to solve. This is not something you should be surprised by if you've played any Larian games or if you've played early access, but there are puzzles, and the use of vertical space is more incorporated into these puzzles. For instance, like in Divinity Original Sin 1 or 2, you might need to find a switch to open a door, or read a book to get a clue for something, and then that opens the door and you go down some stairs and you find something. A lot of it had to do with like finding these things and figuring out what to do. In this particular space, you kind of knew what you needed to do, but you had to figure out how to get there because things were located in positions that you couldn't just walk up to them. Like they were either behind a locked door or they were high up vertically and you had to figure out how to get up there. Like, could you jump up there and climb up there? Could you fly up there? Could you move it down to you? There's a lot of that went into the, creation of these puzzles, and they've really used that vertical space to make you think a lot more. I remember going through this puzzle going like, how the hell do I do this? Like, I've played tons of Divinity Original Sin 1, tons of Divinity Original Sin 2, lots of Baldur's Gate early access, and I still couldn't wrap my head around how much they use the vertical space. And this is something they've talked a bit about in their promotional materials, but I don't think players are fully going to understand until they get to different parts of the game where they have to think a little bit more three-dimensionally than they have previously or in any other game that I've ever played. So then, obviously, after that, I was able to get into the Githyanki Creche, and there's obviously full of Githyanki in there, and you get to talk and interact with them and really see Githyanki culture and how they do things. And that was kind of a revelation to me, just seeing it all and practice. And, Lizelle is sort of this really interesting character, in terms of the companions that you can pick. But then you're suddenly surrounded by a lot of Lizelles, and it's really interesting to see that dynamic and how they interact with each other as well as they interact with you. And there are really cool things you can do there. I won't get into them at all, but I have found it absolutely fascinating. It kind of reminded me of walking into like the Brotherhood of Steel for the first time in Fallout 1 or Fallout 2, and you're just like, whoa, That's kind of the same feeling that I got. I think players are really, really going to enjoy exploring this area and interacting with the very, very intriguing and interesting characters there. So after doing that, I explored a bit around the area before eventually going to the Shadowlands. And one thing I'll tell you too is the game is a lot more interconnected than you would believe from early access. There are actually like a lot of like hidden doors and backdoor tunnels that connect areas of Act 1 to Act 2 that you don't even know exist yet. And you're going to find these out as you progress the game further and further. So they're actually kind of like shortcuts, if you will, to get to very specific parts of Act 2 from Act 1 that you don't even know about that aren't in early access. So then as we made our way to the Shadowlands, this is a very creepy area of the game. It's probably not as creepy as the Underdark was, in my opinion, but it does have a very creepy feel to it. And one of the things about this area of the game, if you saw the panel from Hell, then you already know this, is there is like a debuff in this area that you need to protect yourself from or you'll die. So you have to have kind of like a light source or a way of protecting yourself. And part of the game's plot is figuring out how to get that, because you're trying to make your way to this tower in this zone in order to figure out who's controlling these parasites. And, you know, part of the game is figuring out how to get to that tower and what method you're going to use to get there. Now, if you've watched the panel from Hell, then you'll have seen something they did that was really cool, is that Sven took one route to get there, and Adam took a separate route. Sven sort of did the traditional good route, where he allied with the Harpers and ambushed the bad guys, took their light, and then went to the tower. That was kind of generally what his plan was. While Adam sided with the bad guys, used them to help get him through, got ambushed by the good guys, killed the good guys, and then went to the tower. So there's, you know, two different things that can happen there. However, in my time playing, I got to the same location that they did during this presentation, and I did something completely different. Now, I don't want to spoil for you what that is, because I want you to find out for yourself what's possible, and I've already given you a lot of spoilers as is. But I just wanted to illustrate to you and kind of, you know, press upon you that it's not just there's like a good, neutral, and evil option in this game like you would have in something like KOTOR or you'd have in something like Dragon Age. There is good, evil, neutral, and all the spectrums in between in terms of the things that you can do. And I think that's really what sets Baldur's Gate 3 apart from some of the great games of the past, is that it's not just three-pronged option, it's more of a gamut of options. So besides this, I explored more of the Shadowlands, and let me tell you too, that something that I didn't mention earlier, that the combat in Act 2 really ramps up. It challenges you far more than Act 1, although there are some challenging moments in Act 1. But the combat for me in Baldur's Gate 3, after playing lots of hours of, you know, Act 1 over and over in the early access, probably several hundred hours at this point, was never the shining star of Baldur's Gate 3. I always figured Divinity Original Sin 2, although the storytelling wasn't as good as Baldur's Gate 3, had better combat. Playing Act 2 has changed my opinion of that. It's not that I don't think that Divinity Original Sin 2 has fantastic combat. It's just that Baldur's Gate 3 catches up significantly in Act 2. And I think there are really a couple reasons for that. One, the encounters are far more interesting from what I've seen so far. They have more interesting enemies. They have harder, more challenging enemies. And the loot rewards are even greater. And also, you know, once you get to level 5 with a character, a lot of things really open up to you. If you're a spellcaster, you get level 3 spells. If you're most martial classes, you gain a second attack. And since that doesn't happen to you till usually the very end of Act 1 in early access as it is now, you don't get to play a lot with that. You get to play a very small amount of time as a level 5 character. But when you're playing through Act 2, you can play a lot of time as a level 5 character, and you get to level 6, which I did, and I almost got to level 7. So your character progression is, you know, starting to extend more and more. These things combined, you know, the more interesting dynamic combat plus the more things you can do in combat really brought the combat up a lot. And it's much more on par with Divinity in terms of creativity, the way tactical nature plays into combat. So I'm very, very happy about this because I was kind of, you know, worried that I would get bored of the combat eventually in Baldur's Gate 3 because it's just, you know, Divinity has such a fantastic combination of elemental aspects and things like that. And I just think that the Act 1 gives you kind of a poor impression in general of how Baldur's Gate 3's combat is going to be throughout the course of the game. And let me just tell you that if you're somebody who's like, man, I really wish Baldur's Gate 3's combat was a lot better, it is so much better from Act 2 onward, which is where you're going to be playing the vast majority of the game. You should relax a bit and you understand that it's going to be really, really good. And there are other things too, which I will touch upon more in subsequent videos, but will mention here. For instance, multi-classing really allows you to mix it up with your characters and try new things. And the itemization of the game is extremely, extremely strong. I will talk more about the itemization in another video. I have written down very specific items that I have found to give you guys, exact examples in terms of the quality of items that you can find. But let me just tell you, some of them are build-changing items that you will build your characters around. And I think that's going to be music to the ears of a lot of players. And one other thing that I really want to mention about Act 2 that was really, really cool to see that I think a lot of players might be wondering about is your companion progression really starts to come into play. Like, it's not something that was badly done in Act 1. That's not what I'm saying, but Act 1 is kind of the setup for your characters. You're kind of finding out what kind of characters they are, how they are going to interact with you, what their personalities are like, and you kind of get a little bit of information about them, maybe a little more if you pass certain roles. But they're kind of a mystery still. Not completely, but a little bit. And when you get to Act 2 and you start progressing Act 2 and you go rest at camp and you start talking to them, a lot of times things just happen. Their plot lines advance whether you were trying to advance their plot lines or not, and you have to deal with it. It's not like, oh, if I leave this guy in camp, I'll never have to do anything with him, and I don't have to worry about some negative outcome. Their plot lines are going to advance as you press on with the game, and things are going to happen that you got to deal with. You got to make tough decisions about who you're going to help, what route you're going to take, and honestly, it was really, really kick-ass to see the way they did a lot of these things. My general impression after playing Act 2 is that the writing in Baldur's Gate 3 is some of the best writing I've seen in gaming. It's up there, and I haven't even seen half the game. So I think if you're someone who's a fan of really fantastic writing that was like, Act 1's writing's okay, but it's nothing to really sneeze at, wait until you get to Act 2. Like, it's really where it's the Empire Strikes Back episode. It's where everything takes a dark turn. You know what I mean? It's not all light and cheery like a lot of Act 1 can be, with a lot of humor and different things that are happening. Not to say that Act 1 is all that way. But I will say the game takes a more serious tone starting in Act 2, gets a bit more interesting with some of these characters. And I think players that are looking for more of a serious game from Larian will really start to see that more in Act 2 than they did in Act 1. So that kind of wraps up my video talking a bit about Act 2, what I got to see, what I got to explore. I tried to keep it as spoiler-free as possible. There are some things you just, in order to be able to talk about it at all and give you some information at all, I had to have mild spoilers in there. I hope you got that warning and didn't ruin anything for you. Try to stay away from that. But I will just say that after playing Act 2, I am more confident than ever in this game. It's actually improved for me as a game. I think it's even better than I originally thought. I think players are drastically underestimating this game in every possible way. You could be the biggest fan of this game and you're still underestimating Baldur's Gate 3. I think it's going to be Game of the Year by a landslide. I don't even think it's close. I don't know if it'll win the Game of the Year award at the Game of the Year Awards because Baldur's Gate 3 is not as much of a mainstream game as something like Breath of the Wild or Starfield. But for me, already, not even having played half the game, not even having played Starfield, not even having played some of these other games coming out later this year, it's Game of the Year. It just is. Everything that I've learned from my time with Larian over the last week, playing the game, has convinced me that this is Game of the Year. I'll be talking more a bit about that in subsequent videos and going through some of the things I guarantee you do not know about this game yet. So stay tuned for that, and let me know what you guys think from the comments so far. What do you think after hearing this stuff? What are you excited about? If you watched the panel from hell, what made you excited about that? Let me know in the comments below.